Hello, everyone. I'm Jenny Cameron, and this is Dr. Malcolm Mackay, and we're live streaming to both Facebook and YouTube. And so, obviously, the recording of this will be available, forever on our YouTube channel. It'll only be on Facebook for about 30 days, and then they remove it. So, welcome those who are watching us. Our topic for tonight is the omega-3 index. And why are we talking about this? What is it? Malcolm's going to cover that. But I'll just say that looking at this, about a year or so ago, we had a couple of people share with us they'd had an omega-3 index test, and they had sent us their results saying, what does this mean? At the time, I hadn't seen what it looked like. It was suggesting that the desirable range is actually quite high, and these people were not reaching that amount. So we'll come back to that. But that's sort of what piqued our interest in this topic, and we started looking at some of the research, and Malcolm's done an excellent job of digesting the research around this. So you want to begin?
Yes, yeah. What is the omega-3 index? It looks at the fats in the blood, more specifically the red blood cell membranes, and it looks at the percentage of those fats that are made up of the long chain omega-3 fats, the EPA and the DHA. Some tests in the past have looked at the plasma, the serum omega-3, but that's sort of a bit of a short-term indicator. Whereas the omega-3 index, as it's now performed on red blood cells or spot blood, is actually looking at the omega-3 percentage in the red blood cell membranes, and red blood cells last in the blood for 3 or 4 months. So it actually gives an indicator of sort of what's happened for the last 2 or 3 months. And it does correlate fairly well with the level in tissues around the body. The issue here is that individuals, plant-based individuals eating perfectly healthy diets, go and have an omega-3 index measured and find that it's almost all of them will find that they're below the so-called desirable range, and then they'll need to turn to a supplement. Or the health practitioners who are interested in this will note that nearly all of their whole food, all of their unsupplemented plant-based patients will have indices below the so-called desirable range, and so they're going to sort of come out with a conclusion that we all need to take a supplement. So when you get the result back from the lab, it sort of has a nice thing along the bottom going from, from green up to yellow, from red, danger, orange, yellow, and then a green zone over towards the right. And usually that index is somewhere along that line. And the red is really up to about 4%. And then once you get to above 8%, it goes green. And so less than 4% is considered high risk. 4 to 8% is intermediate risk. That's how it's reported by the labs that do the measurements. And 8 to 12%, more than 8%, is put in as the desirable range. We're very interested. Where does this come from? What's the evidence for this? So we went back and had a look at some of the research, and in particular, pulled up a 2004 paper by Harris and von Schacke that sort of kicked this off and sort of came up with the range. And Harris was I think is the inventor of the omega-3 index. Harris is also involved with OmegaQuant, a big company that does measurements and sells omega-3 supplements. And he does, on the papers that he prints nowadays, he will note that conflict of interest. Anyway, I pulled out this paper and I'm looking at it now, and there's a nice vertical chart going from red up to green with numbers on it corresponding to the omega-3 index. And at the bottom of that, underneath the text says, these data suggest a desirable range value for omega-3 index of more than or equal to 8% and an undesirable level of less than 4%. So a couple of things I notice here, and that is there's only a small number of studies. A couple of them were matched control studies. You have all these people who have heart attacks or whatever, and then you go and try and find matched people who are similar in, similar smoking, weight, everything. And you look at their omega-3 levels and compare them with maybe with the people who have died. And so I thought that's fairly small numbers. I didn't think that was very good quality data. But regardless of that, I looked at this vertical scale, and I found there was 3 studies, and it was sort of from 3.3 up to 3.8. That was the higher risk people in these studies, the people who had events. Or there was one study, it was a supplement study, what their level was before they supplemented. All of these people on a standard Western omnivorous diet. But then I looked at this top end for the 8%, and I found that in actual fact, these studies started at 6.5% as being the healthier, matched controls. And that the supplement, there was one that went over 8%, and that was, if you take a group of subjects and you look at the baseline and it's 3.4%, you give them a huge supplement and it's 8.3%, and maybe they do a bit better. You can't really say at what point that better cut in. So his own chart there, to me, if he's going to sort of use that data at all, would have to say 6.5% and up, not 8%. However, I don't think the data is very good quality there. Really, the conclusion in that paper is that the main conclusion is that omega-3 indices of less than 4% seem to be associated with bad outcomes and a more than 8% of good outcomes. Not much about the in-between group. So this is where the 8% came from. That less than 4% wasn't as good as higher levels. As I said, in that paper, it was actually levels of 6.5% and above. So I think we can conclude that if you're on a standard American diet or standard Australian diet, omnivorous diet, and you've got a ratio of less than 4, then you probably are at higher risk of disease. This sort of research hasn't found that subjects in the 4 to 8% range, the so-called intermediate risk range, are at increased risk of disease. A lot of the data looking at this is looking at the association of omega-3 levels or intakes and higher levels being associated with lower risk of dying from various disease. And it's a little bit of a these are observational studies, so they just observe a mass of individuals, and they do find that from low to high the risk level decreases for a number of diseases. And there was one study, like the FORCE study, which put together a whole lot of other analyses, just observational, and they found a rather modest effect, even looking at the lowest 20% compared with the highest 20% of omega-3 levels. They found a little bit of a 15% reduced risk of death. But this is observational data, and sometimes it's all we've got, but it's got a lot of confounding factors. Like one of the factors when you're looking at fish or omega-3 intake is fish has a bit of a fishy halo around it, which we don't think it deserves. But it does. And so people who are trying to eat healthy diets, who might be eating more vegetables, doing other things, they'll be doing things like eating fish instead of fatty chicken or instead of beef mince. So there's also as part of that confounding factors, there's the unhealthy ultra processed food eater, and they'll probably have a lousy omega-3 index. So this study is this sort of observational data is probably not just about the omega-3 intake. And then we look at the vegan vegetarians. There was some analyses go, they had very low levels. Yeah, that's because he's looking at vegans on pretty lousy diets, like the EPIC Oxford cohort, for example, had pretty lousy vegan diets. And Dr. Furman sort of disagrees about, oh no, what I was going to say is that the vegans, with their fairly lousy diets even, despite their low levels of omega-3 and their low intakes from their lousy vegan diets, they still have better health outcomes than most people on omnivore diets who tend to have higher levels. But Dr. Furman disagrees with this, and he spoke at the International Plant-Based Nutrition Healthcare Conference we went to in September. And he said that a starch-based or whole foods plant-based diet could lead to neurological disorders because it didn't have enough omega-3s, and we should follow his diet and take an omega-3 supplement. There have been a lot of supplementation studies with omega-3s, and mainly looking at heart disease, and they haven't shown a consistent reduction in heart disease. Because it used to always be thought you could take more omega-3s and fish and things, you'd have less heart disease. The research has not been at all consistent about that. There was one study, the VITAL study, they gave them 1 gram a day. It was a prospective, follow the people over a period of time study, no reduction in heart events. There were some other studies, like there was another one where they took people who had already had heart disease or really high risk, were already on cholesterol tablets, had high triglycerides, and gave them a huge amount of EPA, right? The long chain omega-3s, the EPA, icopentanoic acid, and DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, gave them huge amounts of just the EPA, and they had a modest benefit. But that's a very specific group of people with really high heart disease risk. Can we actually get to the 8% so-called desirable, but we've sort of uncovered that there's not really good evidence that it should be the desirable level? Can we actually get there with a whole foods plant-based diet? Or can we even get to 4%? Some case reports on that, haven't we?
Before I'm going to go into that, I just meant to mention at the start, if you have any questions for us, please put them in the chat. So we had one case of someone who had the omega-3 index test, and at the time was eating a whole food plant-based diet, not necessarily sort of watching, eating avocados, nuts, seeds, and so on. And for a couple of months, ate a much lower fat diet. So just to give you, if you remember, Malcolm was talking about figures like 4%, 8%. So one person's measurement before, not specifically eating flaxseed or anything like that, was 4.9. And after a couple of months of actually going lower fat, it increased. It was just over 5.15.
And we'll explain the possible reasons for this a little bit later.
And we have another case of someone who actually ate, again, had 2 measurements, and the earlier one was around a similar amount, sort of around just under 4.7%. So certainly way above the 4% that's considered. You don't want to be below that. And then that person ate a considerable amount of added flax and chia for a couple of months, and the omega-3 index went up to just under 5.8%. And so what's significant to us is this is someone eating a very healthy diet, in good health themselves, and the highest they could get it, eating a lot of, an omega-3 rich food, was still under 6%. So we think that's quite interesting data.
Even when they look at people who are eating 2 or 3 oily fish meals a week, or a 1 gram omega-3, long-chain omega-3 supplement, even in those cases, many of those people will not get to 8% or above doing that. Do we want to get our omega-3 index up to 8% or above 8%, the so-called desirable range that I think we've sort of taken apart and found is a bit arbitrary and not really based on hard science. Well, there was always potential risks in taking any isolated concentrated nutrient out of the context of food. And so, for example, with the long-chain omega-3s, it looks like there's an increased risk of prostate cancer. You know, in observational studies, there seems to be, even in the intervention studies, I think, a dose-dependent increase in atrial fibrillation. You don't really want to go have atrial fibrillation; it's a stroke risk. And one paper we found months ago was a possible increase in fracture risk as well. So our metabolism does not seem to want to have very high levels of long-chain omega-3s like DHA. Now, I know it's a major component of the brain. However, the brain only removes just a few milligrams a day out of the bloodstream. It sort of doesn't need a lot to maintain its balance. So DHA is concentrated sort of in parts of the body that really need it, like in some of the reproductive organs and in the brain, in the eye, for example. So the body actually regulates DHA production, and that is when you have higher levels of DHA in the blood, the body will make less. And I don't think we'll go through the whole conversion, it's called, thing. And that is, you know, the plant-based essential fats. Remember, I'll just add here that monounsaturated fats are not an essential fat. It's only two of the polyunsaturated groups, called the omega-6 series and the omega-3 series. And for the body to, you know, make its useful things out of it, it needs to turn them into add carbons and make them longer chain fats, hence long chain. And the omega-6s, or linoleic acid, will be made into arachidonic acid. And that's been associated with some inflammatory sort of pathways, but it's not as simple as inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. And the omega-3, there's alpha-linolenic acid in plants, and the body needs to sort of convert that into the longer chain EPA, and then even longer again to the DHA. And so people say the human body has a very limited conversion rate because it only turns a little bit of the plant-based fats into the long chain form. It's probably because it doesn't want to convert a lot of it. At the very first step in this reaction is carried out by the enzyme, a delta-6 desaturase, and that both of these fats feed into the 6s and the 3s. And although it preferentially will sort of take the 3s, this is a problem. If we have a huge amount of omega-6 in the diet, then it'll sort of get in the way of the omega-3s getting into the conversion pathway. And that was interesting with that case study where the ratio really seems to matter. The ratio of how many omega-6s and 3s seems to be more important than the absolute amount. So you could go to a lower fat diet when presumably you had probably less of all of the fats. And yet the subject that we looked at in that case example, had less fat, but actually converted more of the omega-3s into the long chain form. So what might we do? Well, obviously we don't want to have mountains of the omega-6 fats. We don't want to have that ratio way skewed. And this is a problem with the Western diet, including vegan diets, where there can be a huge amount of omega-6s in the vegetable oils, etc., and then not many omega-3s. So we might want to include some more omega-3 rich foods. The omega-6 is sort of in everything, like my morning, the whole grains have quite lots of things. A lot of the nuts and seeds have more omega-6s. So how do we get more omega-3 rich foods into the diet? Well, I'll note here that many of the so-called healthy fats that people talk about are actually quite low in omega-3s, like the ratio is not particularly favorable for omega-3s in avocados or olive oil. There's almost no omega-3s in things like almonds and not many in peanuts. We've got an FAQ on our website about this called What About Healthy Fats? Yeah, it's hay fever season down here in Melbourne. There's quite a few everyday whole foods, plant-based foods that do actually have some omega-3s, in modest amounts, like soy. Green leafy vegetables proportionately has a lot of them, but of course it doesn't have a lot of fat in total. So we'll get some from there. We add about 10 grams of flax to our day, usually cooked in our oats or something. And we sort of choose flax because it's very high in omega-3s and because it has other health benefits. It's a whole package. It has a very beneficial type of dietary fiber, for example. So I guess if we're looking at the DHA supplements, we'll just call them DHA. They're usually mixed with EPA and DHA. First of all, we don't really want anyone to be having the fish ones because they're going to have contaminants. And I definitely I'm a supporter of Sea Shepherds. I'm not allowed to admit that. And so I don't want anyone having anything with krill in it because that's a bit of a disaster, the harvesting of krill in the southern oceans. But let's move on from the environment here. Who might benefit from the DHA supplement? Well, someone with a very suboptimal sort of diet ratio of omega-6s and omega-3s, particularly if that person was pregnant and breastfeeding, although the body has a higher conversion rate in that situation because it knows it needs to provide more DHA. And then people often talk about the elderly. We've in the past reviewed some of the so-called evidence that the elderly benefit from more omega-3s, and we thought it was pretty dubious actually. But a lot of elderly people have a pretty shocking, undereat and have very low nutrient density diet. So that's really their problem. Like we don't really need a supplement. We need to give them some healthy food. So I guess the bottom line is that we do not recommend, or the bottom line is that the omega-3 index data suggests that having a very low level is bad for our health and has negative outcomes, but that the intermediate range has really no definite disadvantage over the more than 8% range. And so we do not recommend a long-chain omega-3 supplement for people on a healthy whole foods plant-based diet. And I would also caution anyone who takes someone else's advice, you're free to do that, and takes a supplement, I would caution them to keep the dose very low because otherwise you might be increasing some other health risks.
So we haven't had anyone ask any questions, but just to round this up, it's there's been a little bit of controversy.
It's an area of controversy in whole foods plant-based,
and so we hear from people who are a little bit scared. They think, particularly if they do have that omega-3 index test, thinking, oh, I'm low. It says that I'm low, so I must supplement. And I mean, our from what we've looked at, if you're in that 4.5, 5, 5.5, 6 range, if you do have the omega-3 index test, you're perfectly healthy. That so much of the science that people even in the plant-based world use as evidence of particular agendas is with people eating the standard Western diet who are not particularly healthy. So and so I'm seeing someone said that it was 6.82%. So that's pretty high from from our reading of it. So yeah, we were a little bit gobsmacked to see that there really wasn't a good rationale for setting the index as 8 to 12% being desirable, and that from knowing of the couple of people that we know who have had a for some repeat omega-3 indexes and change their diet a little in a couple of directions, that we can see that eating the healthiest whole food plant-based diet, and people being in beautiful health, at the time that they're doing that, that they're never going to get near the 8%.
No, and you won't get there. You're unlikely to get there from eating the plant-based ALA. And I don't think I added when I was talking about the conversion rate. More talked about the omega-6s getting in the way. There's one of the final steps in the production of DHA. It's actually the enzyme that turns DPA into DHA. Actually has a little feedback mechanism where that enzyme becomes less active when there are higher blood levels of DHA. So you can see the body actually has a little mechanism there to limit the amount of DHA it has. And there's currently some research happening in the world. I'm sorry, I can't remember the author who's doing it. I listened to him on a podcast once where his group's actually giving people different levels of DHA and trying to ascertain how high in the blood is the DHA level before the body sort of switches off the conversion.
Okay. I'm not sure what this comment is. Should I start steroids and ascend? Don't know what that means.
Not sure what that means.
You might need to explain yourself with that one. So if there's no more questions, then we might sign off. And so this little mini video will be available for you to watch again through, as I said at the start, through Facebook for up to 30 days, but then Facebook removes it, and that'll be on our YouTube channel. And you can watch any of our past live streams on our YouTube channel. And if you like following us, we do occasionally send out a newsletter. We've just sent out one yesterday, 2 days ago. And we also run a few events. Next year we've got a 7-day immersion in late April, and we've been doing 4-part webinar series, which so people from all around Australia, we even had a couple of New Zealanders join us, can join us, and we've now expanded that to be a 5-part webinar series, so starting at the beginning of March next year. So you can find that all out from our website. I'll put the links in the notes under the YouTube video. So I think we'll stop there. So thank you for those who have watched us live, and thank you for those who are coming across this video after the event. We'll see you next time. Good night.
Good night.